these two groups of companies today is primarily their intention. The intention to decarbonize very dramatically and very quickly over the next 30 years. Now, we know that intentions are not action. Today, we actually take companies at their word, but the proof is going to be in their pathways. How are we going to measure that? It is extremely important that these new metrics be dynamic. We need to be capturing the actions that companies are delivering against their decarbonization intentions. Now, even if we took all the companies' net zero pledges around the world, today, only about 10% of companies are actually on track to stay under 1.5 degrees. 90% of them exceed a 1.5 degree warming. So as an investor, you might say, well, maybe I'll just own those 10%. But let's think about that. Can 10% of the companies in the world actually thrive in a world that is burning all around them? We really can't hide from climate change any more than we can hide from gravity. And so we can't actually divest into a net zero world. We do actually really need to do that hard work of identifying in every sector which companies can be part of the solutions for the future and which companies are going to make the problem worse. Today, the world's public companies are on track to take us to a world that is 3 degrees warmer. We can look at that and despair at that bleak future, or we can feel galvanized that every day we're seeing more companies and more investors really step up, come forward to change that trajectory. I think with the right measures and the right disclosures, investors can do what they're best at, which is to allocate capital efficiently, to fund the companies of the future that will really benefit their portfolios and help us all get to a more sustainable world. Thank you.
Please welcome to the virtual stage Dr. Friederike Otto, Senior Lecturer of Climate Science at Imperial College of London, in conversation with Bloomberg Green's Eric Roston.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending what poses to be a fascinating conversation with a fascinating person. Dr. Friederike Otto is Senior Lecturer at Imperial College London, and for the last several years, she has led a team that has time and time again answered the fundamental question that a lot of people have about climate change, or really about the weather, which is climate change behind it? So Dr. Otto, thank you so much for joining us. Just for starters, why don't you share with us a little bit about, I don't know, how did you get into this to begin with? People were asking for years, was climate change involved in this or that weather event, before your team came along and said, yes, 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 maybe, and probably yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think the main reason why I got into this is precisely because people are constantly asking the question, when an extreme event happened, what's the role of climate change? And for a long time, the reaction of scientists to that question was a bit unsatisfactory. It was either saying, well, we can't attribute individual weather events, but it might be the kind of, it's the kind of event we expect to see more of. Or people would say, well, we're living in a world where climate change is happening, so obviously that affects the weather. And the latter is trivially true, but it doesn't tell you much. It doesn't contain much information, because it doesn't really answer the question how and to what extent climate change affects the weather. And so therefore we started to try and answer that question, so that there was not just people with an agenda, a political agenda answering the question, but also scientific evidence to put into the discussion.
What are some of the most startling findings that you have uncovered in the 6 years that World Weather Attribution has been live?
That's a difficult question because there are some events, and one that probably is still in the memory of many people is the heat wave in Canada and the northern US this summer. That was an event that would have been basically impossible to occur without climate change. And we looked at the heat wave in Siberia last year. That was also an event where climate change was a complete game changer and only made the event possible. But I think there are also there are other events where climate change did play a smaller role, or where it even didn't really play a role at all, that were I think really important studies for us to do. So one is on a drought in Sao Paulo that happened in 2014, where we found that climate change did actually not alter the likelihood of that event to occur, but because of an almost exponential increase in the water usage in the area, the impacts of that drought were dramatically were dramatically worse than they would have been 10 years earlier. And so that, I think it's really just how big a role the vulnerability and whether or not people are informed, or if there's early warning about the events, how much of a role that plays in turning a weather event into a disaster is something that is often more shocking to me actually than the climate change signal.
I want to I want to take a second and so last month, Dr. Otto worked with us at Bloomberg Green on a profile of her and her team's work, and I want to give a sense and transition here a second. Like this is a very small group of people that you have organized. You have gone from a project as an arm of a nonprofit in 2015 to basically a global media phenomenon. The heat wave you mentioned in June, I think, got something on the order of 3,500 articles written about it, newspaper articles around the world. And you and your co-founder, Geert-Jan van Oldenburg, were made Time Magazine's two of the 100 most influential people in the world in September. I want people to understand that background to understand the next thing I want to say. So I worked with Freddie. I worked with Geert-Jan, excuse me, who suffered through the rise of this organization from cancer for 8 years. And struggled until his end in October when he passed away of this disease. And I want to spend a few minutes just hearing you speak about him. Interviewing him, interviewing you, interviewing your colleagues about him was an extremely moving and memorable experience. And I'd like everyone in the audience to know who he was and what he did to help you achieve this work you've been doing.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about Geert-Jan, because we were colleagues. So we started to do world weather attribution together. But when we started it, I was a postdoc who had written and published one academic paper. So I didn't have a track record of actually being able to pull something off in the academic world. And still he treated me and we have been like a partner from the start. We have been partners from the very start, despite him having 20 years more experience, lots of academic credit in climate science. And we had a very comparable, different skill sets, but really the same goals. We both wanted to answer the question that people actually ask of scientists. So try to make science as useful as we possibly can, and answer the question that we can answer, but crucially not more. And that was something that Gert-Jan has always aimed at doing. And also he didn't only wanted to get the science right, but really do the right thing. And before we started to work together on world weather attribution, he had developed a platform that's called Climate Explorer that allows everyone in the world, even with the most crappy internet connection, to access all observational data from weather stations in the world that are shared publicly, and all climate model data that is available, so that science is less of a less exclusive endeavor, and that really is inclusive of people around the world, people who might have not training in programming and so on, and that also allowed us to include in all our weather at home studies always people from the area of the events that occurred, and that was I think one of the main reasons why it was successful, because we didn't try and answer the question that might be scientifically most attractive, but by working with the Red Cross, by always working with people in the area, we try to understand what is it about this weather event that actually are people vulnerable to, and then identify the role of climate change in that event. And Gert-Jan was absolutely passionate about this work. He worked on it until days before his death in October. The study, I will have to finish the study, but I will. And he, without him, this would not have been possible, because he had the tools, he had the statistical skills, and that put together with my skill set, which is more in interpreting the data, putting it into words, really made us able to answer the questions, to go to the edge of the science, but not beyond, and answer it in a way that that people can understand.
Yeah, I do. I really hope people are hearing and will remember your comments, remember Gert-Jan, because the limited time I knew him, it's just, science, it comes out over headlines. It's discussed by politicians, it's discussed in business, it's discussed everywhere. But there are people, in Gert-Jan's case, just really extraordinary, warm, giving, but wholly unsentimental, science-minded people who are behind this and providing answers to questions that people have. Now, one thing that was very important to him, I know, is, and you mentioned his weather database, was he had a real interest in democratizing data and making climate analysis of weather something that anyone can do on any internet connection anywhere in the world. And so tell us a little bit about the democratization of this work. Who will be able to, in the near term, do this kind of work on extreme weather events? And then what's next for world weather attribution as this skill set becomes more broadly accessible?
So in theory, really everyone can do these kind of studies, because what we don't do in world weather attribution is to wait for our studies to be peer reviewed before we publish them, because we want the scientific evidence to be available when the public and the media are discussing the role of climate change in the event, which is on timescales that the peer review process cannot possibly manage in academia. But of course, peer review is crucially important for the quality of the science, and it's the fundamental basis of the scientific methodology. And so not to publish rubbish, basically, we had to try and mimic the peer review process in a way that allows us to do these studies quickly. And so what we do is, every time we do a study, we write a scientific paper, which is a relatively boring read, but it lays out in all detail what are our assumptions, which data do we use, why do we use it? And on the Climate Explorer, so on this platform that Gert-Jan built, all the data is available, and all the routines, the statistical methods that we use are available there to use. So everyone can go and check, did we actually make a mistake? What did we do? And of course, so in theory, everyone can do this. The problem and the bottleneck with world weather attribution is always that it's very hard to do this if you have never done it before, and if you don't have the expertise and in climate science or in statistics or in some natural background, and have actually looked at extreme weather events. Because what you do in attribution is bringing together observations and often very messy data on the ground on small locations with large scale climate models. And both types of data are very different and need to be analyzed in very different ways, but then still need to answer the same question. And that's non-trivial, and that takes some expertise. And so that is what has always been the bottleneck for world weather attribution, because it's an initiative that we are doing because we find it important. But it's not one where we have funding, or we have a large team of postdocs who can help with the work. And so we always work with people who volunteer their time, and there is just a limited number of people around the world who have the skill set and are able to drop everything and work with us for a week on the study. So one goal for world weather attribution going forward is to put it on a bit more sustainable feet, so that we are able to do studies slightly less ad hoc, and particularly more in the global south, because it's still always a lot easier to find people with a heat wave in Canada, for example. Immediately, a group of Canadian scientists said, yes, we really want to know the answers. Here we are, and we work with you. Whereas in most scientists employed in the global south don't have the mandate to do research. They have a mandate to teach and to provide weather forecasts or other services, and just don't have the capacity to drop everything. And so that is something which world weather attribution will need to be able to fund in order to fill these big gaps in the global south in our understanding of how climate change affects weather.
Just in the last minute or two we have here, since we're gathered either actually or virtually at COP26 in Glasgow, what specifically for the diplomats engaged in the negotiations and the many groups and interests sort of swarming around them, what's the message from world weather attribution to people whose job it is this week to get their arms around emissions and, turn them off eventually?
Well, I think a big message from world weather attribution is that the era of loss and damage has long begun. So climate change is not something happening somewhere else in the future, but is killing people already now on a large scale. And that is at 1.2 degree warming. So we don't really want actually to imagine how that would be in a 3 degree world, or even in a 2.5 degree world, which is sort of around where current pledges are, because for the most vulnerable in our society, it's already unsustainable. And so that means there's absolutely no doubt that not burning fossil fuels is incredibly more cheaper than continue to burn fossil fuels. But also we need to address adaptation and loss and damage that is happening already. It's not just a problem of the future.
Wise words. Thank you so much, Dr. Otto, for joining us. Anyone interested in following up, and I expect everyone will be, world weather attribution can be found at worldweatherattribution.org. There is all of the studies they've done are there in an accessible for the public format. And at Bloomberg Green, you can read our recent profile of Dr. Otto. And just today, we published an overview of how they did their June heatwave study in the US and Canada. So thank you again, and everyone enjoy your time at COP if that's the right sign off here. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Planet co-founder and CEO Will Marshall.
Hi everyone. So this COP is the COP where nature went from being a sideshow that was more or less ignored to being center to the party. And the very next step after people, countries, companies make their commitments on nature is measurement and accountability. And that's where satellites come in. And so I'm going to show a few slides today about how we use satellites to help us to monitor everything going on around the planet and help that accountability step and the tools that enable us to take care ultimately of what we call spaceship Earth. So you can't fix what you can't see, or as Mike Bloomberg likes to say, you can't manage what you don't measure. Until you measure it, you can't manage it. We've had many examples of this, but what we set out, my team and I, when we left NASA about 10 years ago, was to launch a fleet of satellites that would enable us to image every point on the Earth's landmass once per day. And having launched the largest fleet of satellites in human history, we got to imaging the whole Earth every day in 2017. And what we're trying to do now is make that data visible, accessible, and actionable so that everyone can utilize that data to empower them to make smarter decisions on a whole range of activities. Just a few examples of some of the things we've been doing recently. We've been helping in Germany with the floods as they afflicted, both helping with the real-time law enforcement and activities for the response and for preventative work afterwards. We found oil spills recently in New Mexico, and we discovered a whole set of nuclear missile silos in Western China that was previously undisclosed. And so we are shedding light on world events and helping the adaptation of the planet to sustainability. It's super important across a whole range of areas: agriculture, finance, manufacturing, forest management. Of course, there was a big announcement this week about ending deforestation. We can help that substantively. And it's all about having data in the timescale to do action. So historically, satellite data have been the point where at the end of the year, you would have a stock count of the Amazon and you would find there's a big hole. Well, now we're having data on a daily basis. We can literally image and see every tree, and if a tree goes down, we can take action before any major logging activity takes place. And 40% of logging takes place in the form of forest degradation at the individual tree level. We can see individual trees. So it's timely information that enables us to act. But it's not just in the field of deforestation, it's in a wide area. And in fact, it's also extremely useful for sustainable finance, and I'll talk briefly about that. Broadly, this data set is empowering digital transformation of the global economy, where big data and AI are helping industries to digitize and the sustainable transition of the global economy. It can help with both the monitoring and measurement of ecological sites, the efficient operations of them, like in sustainable agriculture, and improving transparency and reporting to ensure that our companies and countries are staying accountable to the goals that they set. Let me give you a couple of examples. A couple of months ago, we released the first map of all the world's coral reefs. It was the first time that coral reefs had ever been tracked, and we can surprisingly track the type of coral reefs from our satellite data because we have all these different spectral bands that enable us to tell the type of coral reef. So we did that for the whole world. And already, I'm pleased to say that 6 countries have established marine protected areas around the coral reefs that we mapped for them. It shows you how countries take action when you show them the goods, show them the huge value. And then I was speaking here at Bloomberg Green Summit last year, and we had just announced this partnership with Norway to track all the world's tropical forests on a daily basis and help them prevent deforestation. So Norway paid for this data. It's available through the UN to the forestry ministries in all 64 of these tropical countries. And 1 year in, I'm pleased to say we have 132 countries and over 9,000 researchers using this data to track daily change. And it's amazing. In many countries, our data is used before and after images to hold landowners accountable in courts of law thousands and thousands of times last year across many different countries, helping stop and enforce illegal deforestation. And this week we had the 1 year anniversary of that event here at COP, and it was really great to be celebrating that, and we're hoping to scale that up. Finally, we have a forest observatory of California. We're hoping to extend this to the world, but basically this is tracking wildfires. It's useful for two things. One is the detection of wildfires to help the emergency response. Where's the line of the fire? Where's the wind blowing? And so on, to help the real-time action. And we can tell the amount of material in the forest through our near-infrared band, which enables us to basically tell where's the sources of future megafires to help the firefighters with preventative work. We started with California. We mapped every tree in California, helped understand the stocks and future potential for fire. And now we're helping them to expand this to other regions of the world. We want to extend it to other rural regions that are afflicted by wildfires. This is one mission I didn't mention this time last year because it didn't exist. This year we announced that we're building a third fleet of satellites. It's called Carbon Mapper, which are able to detect point source methane and CO2 emissions across the whole globe at the facility level and down to a sensitivity that will be able to detect 90% of methane sources. So NASA JPL flew a hyperspectral instrument over California doing a baseline to find all the methane sources, from whether it's from agriculture facilities, waste management centers, or oil and gas leaks from those places. We are taking that instrument, putting it in space on a few dozen spacecraft that will enable us to monitor point source methane emissions. Again, methane was one of the targets here. The next step after we set those targets is measurement and holding accountability. This fleet of satellites is exactly dedicated to that, and Bloomberg Philanthropies very kindly donated $25 million to this fleet of satellites to help us to build it, bringing the total funding of this to $125 million to get us to the first few satellites. So I'm here to bring you the message that the next step on all of these commitments at COP is measurement and accountability. And satellite data is not a silver bullet, but it's a significant value to helping us with that next phase of accountability, whether you're a country or a company. And so with that, I have time for a couple of questions if there's any questions, but that's Planet. Thank you. They said there may be a couple of questions if there's any questions. Yes, take.
Thank you. I'm Charlotte Morton from the World Biogas Association. Will you be able to map methane emissions from organic waste, food waste, landfill sites, manures and slurries?
Yeah, so the question is, can we measure methane emissions from agricultural sites? And the answer is yes. These set of satellites will be able to monitor and catch methane emission down to 100 kilograms of methane produced per hour. And that is the kind of scale where most agriculture facilities are more than that when they're producing methane. So we should be able to see those. Again, the California survey showed that 100 kilograms per hour is about the sensitivity you need to catch 90% of sources, and a good fraction of them were in agriculture. So we should be able to do that, at least for the significant methane source emitters. Yeah, any other questions? Yes?
Principal Global Investors. How do you come up with the suggestions and partnerships with Bloomberg or with the Norwegian government? Do you have a list of ideas that you put on your website, or how do you find and partner with investors?
Well, it happens all different ways. Some people approach us and say, well, you're doing this, can we help? Other people, so Norway was looking at deforestation. How do we manage that problem? They were actually entertained building their own satellites and then found out about Planet and said, okay, well, you can do that already, great. Let's pay for that data for these countries. It happens in different ways. It happens by telling people like yourselves that this exists, because most people don't still know that these sort of systems of, like we have 200 satellites imaging the whole Earth every day. A lot of people aren't even aware that that tool exists. So it's also getting on the stage and telling people. Any other questions? Yeah, at the back. We've got
Thank you.
19 seconds.
The work you're doing with coral reefs is very exciting, and I wanted to explore another possibility for the ocean. The ocean is the biggest carbon sink. Plankton is to the ocean as trees are to the land when it comes to carbon. So do you foresee being able to track plankton and the health of plankton in the seas and the blooms that come up and kill all the fish and all these things? What kind of work are you doing with that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, strangely enough, we can see the algae blooms from space. We see that really regularly. I mean, we obviously can't see the individual plankton and algae, but not that good. But we can see them en masse, and we do. And we can track those. And the patterns of that both are important for climate, as you mentioned. Also, they tend to correlate with disease outbreaks in tropical countries, and so we are monitoring it also for health reasons. But we're very open to collaborative ideas where this sort of data could be utilized for that sort of work. We're trying to extend the corals work to include seagrass and mangroves, and I think your point about algae blooms is actually really a smart one. We haven't got a project in that area yet, but I'd love to start one. Come and chat to me afterwards. Thanks very much, everyone.
Time is running out. Rising greenhouse gas emissions are impacting sea levels, the climate, food systems, land and water. We need a new sustainability approach now if we are to get to net zero emissions by 2050. With the virtual twin we can. The virtual twin is an exact digital representation of our physical world to imagine, design and test anything from cars to cities, even to human hearts, for a more sustainable tomorrow.
Please welcome to the stage Florence Verzelen, Executive Vice President of Marketing, Industry and Sustainability at Dassault Systèmes, in conversation with Bloomberg Green's Lauren Keel.
Florence, we've heard a lot about physical infrastructure today, buildings, energy, but as someone who works in the digital space, I would love to hear from you. What do you think about the role of the digital sector in sustainability?
Thank you very much for the question, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, my belief is if we want to build sustainable industry, sustainable infrastructure, sustainable product, we need the power of digital. Why? Because basically, artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things, virtual twins are very powerful tools if you want to invent, innovate, simulate, produce in a different manner, and if you want to basically create a sustainable economy. So I think we cannot do without the power of digital, and it's an untapped opportunity till now. And I know as well that there are questions about the emission of tech. And well, that's something I'd like to discuss with you because yes, we're emitting a lot today, but what I'd like to convey as a message is that we have taken many of us have taken a lot of commitment. For example, at Dassault Systèmes, we have committed to SBTi and net zero emission because we want to make sure that when we provide technology solutions to our customer and to the industry, it brings a net positive sustainable benefit to our customers.
So you mentioned how you all have made a sustainability commitment. You're working with many others who've made those as well and using technologies to help bring those to life. And you were telling me about how you're using virtual twins to do so. Can you explain what a virtual twin is to the audience and how that applies to sustainability?
Yes, of course. A virtual twin is a real-time digital representation of a product, a company, or an ecosystem. And it's very useful if you want to model, simulate, predict, and basically get feedback on your product. It's an untapped opportunity to drive operational costs, but also to basically simulate your value chain, your supply chain, to make it circular and sustainable. Why? Because basically when you have the virtual twin of your product, be it a plane, a bridge, a housing, or a bottle of shampoo, you can do thousands or millions of simulations on your virtual twin and basically test different materials, different processes, different technology in the virtual world to only produce, go into manufacturing with the most sustainable option. So it's very, very powerful. And let me tell you about an example, Model Scale. Model Scale is a product we are doing with one of the largest energy companies in the world. And it's about doing the virtual twin of a territory in order to test multiple options when it comes to power and heat networks. And by testing multiple options, basically the territory can decide what is the most sustainable option for them in this particular context. And what's working for a city, a territory, is working for a lot of industry. In fact, in January this year, we released a study that we have done with Accenture that is basically calculating the impact of using virtual twin in 5 industries: high-tech, car, packaging, life science, and consumer industry. And with just 5 use cases of virtual twin, we could save 7.5 gigatons of CO2 and create a value of $1.3 trillion. So it's just huge in terms of impact.
Wow. You mentioned the financial impact there, and that's something we heard so many times this morning, right? The challenge of getting the financing around this, making that, we heard it from John Kerry, we heard it from every one of these speakers. Do you think that this technology or something similar to this, how can that help with bridging that financial challenge?
Yes, I do. I think this technology can really create value, create new way of working, manufacturing, new jobs. Actually, we have some study from the World Economic Forum that also show that with the development of digital technology, the net impact on jobs is going to be positive by 20 million jobs creation. So it's huge. And well, the optimistic factor I have is also that we did a global study recently with a lot of executives from a lot of industry. And basically 70% of them were telling us they think it's imperative for them to include sustainability in the design and innovation of their new product and services. Unfortunately, only 26% know how. So basically, I think what is up to us as tech leaders is really to basically show the technologies that are available out there, because there are a lot of untapped opportunity that can make the world more sustainable.
One quick final question. As someone in the digital and tech space, what do you hope comes from COP26?
Well, we are part of the companies who have signed to ask for government to find an agreement to stay within the limit of 1.5 degrees. So that's really what we are committed on. That's really what we want to push for. And as I said, I think that as a technology company, we can bring a lot of solutions. We want to work with other technology companies, and we basically, like John Kerry said this morning, think that we have a seat on the table to help change the world and make it a more sustainable place.
Florence, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome to the virtual stage TPG Rise Climate's Jonathan Garfinkel, Carmichael Roberts of Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and the U.S. Department of Energy's Jigar Shah for a conversation with Bloomberg NEF's Claire Curry.
Great, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to our speakers for virtually joining us as well. I'm hoping technology is our friend today and this all works out and we get a good connection. There's been a lot of talk at COP about the technologies needed to reach net zero. And one of the big levers for scaling those technologies is the finance behind it. The last few years, we've seen actually relatively small amounts of VC, PE money and very little public money going into climate tech startups. This year, in the last 18 months particularly, has actually been very different. We've seen this year, just between January and September to date, over $40 billion of money going into the VC, or from VC PEs to startups, in what we would call climate tech. And there's been dozens of IPOs and particularly SPACs as well, helping get access to climate technologies, or helping give access to public market funding. I am really excited today to be joined by three gentlemen who know this space incredibly well, and we're going to be talking about recent trends, who's raising money, what needs to happen, who these investors are, and what to expect to see in the next year or two. So I hope it's going to be very, very helpful and interesting. I want to start off by actually talking a bit about climate tech or clean tech 1.0, because we've seen this before. About 10 years ago, there was a big rise in VC funding into clean tech, solar, wind, storage. And actually, some of it had success, but some of it fizzled away. So maybe, Jigar Shah, given you've got such a long experience in this space, do you want to start off by telling us a bit about how is this time different to what we saw in clean tech 1.0? How is kind of funding now and excitement about startups different?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'd say that people get confused about the returns that investors make in venture capital and the returns that the public makes in decarbonization. So when you think about clean tech 1.0, the governments around the world set up feed-in tariffs. They set up all sorts of learning curve policies. And as a result, we've seen trillion-dollar scale in solar and wind, as well as in EV manufacturing. None of that would have occurred without the level of investment in clean tech 1.0 early on, right? And so we've reached trillion-dollar scale in those three markets. Now the question is, what are the next markets that we're going to hit trillion-dollar scale? And there are certainly markets that were too early the last time around, but many of them are still here. I mean, hydrogen is one of them, for instance. Hydrogen, I was at conferences and presentations for hydrogen in 2003, 2005. But today the technology is in a place where you can see trillion-dollar scale in hydrogen, where it just wasn't ready in 2009.
Great. Okay, so it's a case of actually some of these technologies now being ready to receive that money and do something with it. Jonathan, when you look at this space, what are the technologies and sectors and industries receiving the most interest from early stage and later stage VCs and PEs?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. It's very nice to be here. We at TPG Rise Climate, we're evaluating very broad spectrum and within the climate ecosystem, and that ranges. In our case, we're looking at situations that have graduated beyond venture capital and are into that growth and scaling phase. So that is picking up everything from long duration storage, biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, software that's powering grid management and so on, material space, carbon capture. It's very broad. We're really thinking of climate as a sector the same way you would healthcare or technology, and that opens up a really big universe of opportunities.
And thank you, that's helpful. So Carmichael, coming to you and your work with particularly material impact and breakthrough energy ventures, part of the BEV's mandate, right, is to invest in technologies that aren't traditionally attractive to quick returns and exits. What are the technologies you've been looking at or you think actually still haven't received as much VCPE funding or as much interest as they should have done that you'd like to highlight?
Oh, can you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's interesting. I think we've lost it. Jigar, can you hear me?
Yeah, she just asked you about what the next generation of VC technologies might be they're missing out.
Okay, maybe we can come back to Carmichael when he's got audio sorted. Do you want to answer that for us, maybe, Jigar, while we just wait and see what happens with
Sure. I think when you think about trillion-dollar scale, the next set of technologies where government policy has created a clear pathway is, for instance, sustainable aviation fuel. I think you're going to see a huge amount of money into, I think you saw the announcement from 12 the other day, you saw announcements from some of the world's leading producers scaling up for the low carbon fuel standard credit program. in California. I also see a huge amount of money going into small modular reactors, micro reactors, and even fusion. I mean, I think we saw a few big announcements there. So I think when you think about the next set of trillion-dollar markets, we're starting to see a huge amount of not just innovation, but innovation turning into commercialization in these sectors. I'd also talk about plastics and recycled plastics, the circular economy, and then also just minerals, right? Critical minerals, batteries. It used to be that we were all just saying that lithium-ion batteries were going to be it, but today I think you see 5 or 6 additional battery chemistries with additional critical mineral supply chains that are coming strong and are able to meet the same level of cost performance as well as value performance of lithium-ion batteries.
Great, that's helpful. Can you hear us now, Carmichael? It doesn't look like it. So, Jonathan, you mentioned you're in the growth equity space, and I think what probably a lot of climate tech startups have struggled to do is actually go from the Series A and B they've been raising across that valley of death to the large amounts of money that will help them commercialize the technology. Jigar was mentioning things like batteries, nuclear fusion, hydrogen. These are capital-intense projects that require a lot more funding than a software startup does, for instance. Can you talk to us a bit about the role of growth equity in this space particularly? Because it's a bit of a new area for big PE firms like TPG and others to be getting into. What do you think specifically the role you can play in growth equity for climate is?
Yeah, Claire, it's a great question, and it very much is the driving force behind the pool of capital that we are just wrapping up raising at TPG. So we came to the market earlier this year on this premise that these are very capital-intensive, physical-type companies, very different from the technology revolution that we've all lived through over the last several decades. And accordingly, we have raised a private equity-style fund, which we've now closed on a little over $6 billion, and we're on our way to raising a little over $7 billion when all is said and done here, precisely so that we can be a growth source of capital for companies that, as we're out in the market every day talking to, their business plans have $300, $400, $500 million capital needs in many instances. And whereas earlier in the year, we saw a lot of companies jumping to the SPAC market because that was uniquely a big enough pool of capital to fund those business plans, we're glad to be offering effectively a private alternative for companies that might otherwise not be ready for the public markets and all the demands therewith. So we're having an interesting dialogues in the market every day with companies that need a lot of capital, and we're happy to be bringing that private equity toolkit to help them grow and scale. Which, by the way, per your initial question, I think that's another difference between Clean Tech 1.0. Is having these pools of capital, whether they're coming from the government through things like what Jigar's doing or things that we can provide, is to help them get through that next big phase in their evolution with the capital behind them to support their growth.
Yeah. Carmichael, can you hear us now?
I can. I went off the headset and I'm going computer.
Great. So you didn't miss much, but we've been talking a bit about some of the stuff that actually this is great. So where Bev can come in and where Bev is really, I think, important here is highlighting the areas that are really hard to scale, where capital is important, and maybe where traditional VCs wouldn't have gone, right? We're not looking at software or kind of maybe endless scooter sharing platforms. We're looking at things that actually, you need, like Jigar was saying, I don't know if you heard him, but things like nuclear fusion, right? Modular reactors, hydrogen, battery storage. He mentioned plastics. Are there other areas you're looking at that you think, for the VCs in the audience, they should be looking to, or other kinds of investors should be looking into?
No, I think I did hear what Jigar said, and I agreed with Jigar. I agree with everything that you said. Maybe I'll just come back, instead of naming just specific technologies, I would just look at whole areas that I think are still undermined. So look at stuff in oceans right now. I think think about right now, there's probably more going on in outer space than we're really doing in oceans. Does that really make sense when you think about the richness of what we can do in oceans? And within, subsets like that, I think there are lots of opportunities, but I actually agree with a lot of the topics that Jigger brought up. We're seeing those that just 5 years ago, people wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, but today they're being addressed. And of course, carbon capture is still, as far as I'm concerned, pretty much nowhere in terms by comparison to other areas.
Yeah, definitely. So Jigger, going back to the point that Jonathan was making in that actually now we're beginning to see VCPEs enter areas that a decade ago were maybe seen as being too risky or not enough returns. And that's where kind of the LPO, right, the Loan Programs Office, stepped in and said, we're going to actually prove that we can not only make money in this space, but we can actually really scale stuff that maybe the private sector doesn't want to touch. Can you tell us a bit about the role of the LPO now and how that might change or not change if we are going to see this big influx of private capital also scaling kind of the hard to scale climate tech?
No, it's a good question. I think that in general, the SPAC market as well as the private market is very important. But that pitch that investors make is really a pitch around the future of how things are going to get better. And it's an equity story, right? And most of these entrepreneurs have not really been able to put together a debt story. And I think, as we know, $1 trillion scale requires debt, right? Because that's how infrastructure is funded. And so when you think about LPO's mission, when the secretary came in, we had almost no applications. Today, we have 100 applications that are either in the office or being actively submitted. And it's for about $80 billion of capital. So you can imagine it's being matched with equity. And it's across 17 sectors, right? So it's a pretty big diversity from EV manufacturing to batteries to critical minerals to nuclear. We got our first nuclear application in, and we have, then you've got about 12 carbon sequestration and storage projects and other things that are coming in. I think that in general, the world needs a better framework around how this whole evolution and migration from the past to the future is occurring, right? When you think about the oil industry and the coal industry and others, they were very traditional corporate equity and debt. The solar and wind industry really transformed project finance for good in the climate space. And the vast majority of entrepreneurs in this sector have no idea what I just said. And they have no idea how to use debt. They don't know how to use project finance. And so when you think about how all of these pieces are going to come together, we need to create a demand signal. And you saw the president make huge announcements in that area around making sure that we're buying green cement and that we're buying green steel and that we're buying electric vehicles and all those things. But then we also have to figure out how to build a bridge to bankability for these entrepreneurs, because the debt markets are not going to meet them halfway or 3/4 of the way. You either qualify for senior commercial debt or you don't know how to raise it. And so the LPO has stepped in and is providing guidance to all these entrepreneurs around, here is what a debt data room looks like, which is different than an equity data room. Here is how we actually figure out how to put these pieces together. And as a result, once we provide a loan to these entrepreneurs, they are sought after by the commercial debt markets because now they're ready to be served. And it's not a technology thing, it's really a conversation and really an emotional thing where they have to move their brains away from equity and towards debt to attract that capital.
Great, yeah, that was really helpful, because you're right, it's a complex topic, so it was nice to hear it explained so well. And Jonathan, going back to what you were saying earlier about growth equity might be another alternative route to avoid maybe going public too soon for some companies. So how do you look at yourself making an exit, or how do you look at returns for yourself? Obviously, if you're funding companies with huge valuations, or by funding them to Series D and E, they are receiving huge valuations, potentially the M&A market is no longer as attractive as it might have been to early stage startups. And we've seen M&A as being the main exit, actually, for a lot of climate tech startups. So are you looking at then giving them that growth equity to help prepare them for public markets? Is that really the only route, do you think, to some of these larger climate tech exits?
I don't think so. I think, as with traditional private equity, the public markets will be a route, but not the only one. We're really seeing it's the early days of this sector. And one of the things, Claire, that we're really focused on is we have a dual mandate to make financial returns and impact. And we measure that as it relates to our climate investments, what we call a carbon yield. So we look at carbon abatement per dollar invested. And part of what we're betting on is that as we help to scale these climate companies and the impact that they'll have, that will have increased interest in be they strategic buyers or the public markets. You know, the public markets today, there was recent research by Bank of America that the cost of equity is about 10% lower for ESG focused companies that are in the top quartile in ESG performance. So the market is paying a premium for forward-thinking companies on ESG and on climate in particular. So we look at it and say, a lot of these companies, just like companies jumped early to the public markets earlier in my career, in the late 90s when it was seen as a good thing to jump too soon. And we're seeing some of that repeat itself here. And so I personally expect there'll be a slowdown in that jump to the public markets, and companies will seek to stay private for longer, just like you've seen companies like Uber lasting in the private markets for longer periods of time because the capital became available to support them through that phase and ultimately become terrific public companies. We very much can see that trend repeating itself. So there will be strategic buyers. I'm quite sure, we have in our fund almost 30 companies that have invested alongside of us as LPs in what's a reasonably unnatural act to come off balance sheet, to be investors alongside us. And the reason they're doing that is to have visibility into these types of companies so that they can watch them grow and potentially want to add them to their portfolios over time. So that should be a route as well.
Okay, that's helpful actually, and that leads into the question I was going to ask Carmichael next, which is about different kinds of investors entering this space, right? Jonathan, obviously TPG, your RISE fund is quite specialized, but some of your LPs may not know much about this space. And Breakthrough Energy Ventures as well has prided itself in hiring a lot of very smart PhDs and scientists, but that's very much not the norm for VCs. Your route has been a little bit different. Do you think you're seeing, and you're meeting at events, and you're co-investing now with investors who actually don't know much about this space, or are learning quick, obviously on the job, and how is that changing the color of the kinds of investments you're seeing and what's going on there?
Yeah, I love that question. I want to take something that I heard Jigger say, and I just heard Jonathan say something that relates to it, and it all comes back to what's different now. One word that I'll tell you that's hugely different right now is just the amount of collaboration that you'll see right now around climate. I mean, it's fundamentally, you take a topic, this will come out in an announcement soon. You take a topic like nuclear, where you may have only had a certain select kind of folks who would put money into it. You're going to start to see financings that you're going to be shocked at the diversity of investors in some of these nuclear companies on a topic like nuclear that a lot of people can't, don't really understand it completely. And some understand it quite well, and just the whole collaboration across the board. And the different types of investors at different stages, different levels of expertise, like you said at BEV, you can see my periodic table that's behind me. We're loaded up with scientific expertise. I'm the business decision maker, keep that in mind, right? And so, there's that. And maybe come back to something that Jonathan said as well, which is this option between public and private. And I couldn't agree with you more, Jonathan, that you said you're going to see in the future more and more companies opting to stay private. I can tell you that this year, in the first half of this year, we had over, I'm going to call it 15 of our companies get approached to go public via SPAC. We had maybe 2 or 3 get approached to go public the old-fashioned way, okay? What was really pretty impressive is we had maybe 10 to 20% of them actually say they wanted to do it. And I want you to think about that for a second. This is a sector that historically has been starved for large amounts of capital. And so as you start to think about the capital you need to build your business and the option of going public, not because you want to be a public company, but because you can load your balance sheet up with the capital. And to Jigger's point, like most entrepreneurs don't know a lot about how to do project financing and debt. I couldn't agree more. So they're looking at, equity as a method. And then keep in mind, definitely less than 20% of those companies, but I think even less than 10% said they didn't want to do it. And in response, the private market responded to the overtures from the SPAC overtures and responded with a diversity of investors that would really make you kind of shake your head in a really positive fashion and say, now that's collaboration. So, and so we've had, 10 of those companies do spectacular private financing. To Jonathan's point, opt for the private route and to stay private because they really just wanted the capital to build their businesses. And I think as those examples emerge and become more public, some of them have been announced already, but as they become more public, and by the way, BEV is not the only firm that's been doing that in our portfolio, all of our co-investors. So, it's a pretty unusual time right now for financing.
Yeah. Do you think, maybe Jigger, I can ask you this question. Do you think that the rush of money and large amounts of money and larger and larger rounds being raised and the ease with which some companies are doing it reflects a lack of actually potentially attractive targets? I know there's thousands of startups out there and there's lots of interesting ones, but there's also, I think, a lot of innovation gaps still. Do you think we're actually seeing the full potential of startup innovation, or is this kind of hunger for investing in anything that's moving really an actually reflection of the fact we need more entrepreneurs and more innovation?
Yeah, I would say that the Paris Agreement was really about countries coming together around innovation, right? I mean, you had mission innovation, you had breakthrough innovation, right? And then I think what happened in the last few years is that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, mapped out 436 technology pathways that were basically proven scientifically, but now needed to break out. And and you saw the collaboration between the Loan Programs Office and Breakthrough Energy. So I think we're now embarking on breakthrough development and breakthrough deployment, right? And as much as this sector is covered by the media, I would say there are large pockets of innovation that are really ready for prime time that have not been covered by the media. I'll give you an example. There are two companies that we're working with that have advanced, plastics conversion from recycling to new usable plastics without the degradation. And I think the media has covered them with plastic straws, right? But they're actually being sought after by the world's largest companies because they get the fact that this is going to be a huge area. So I would say that as much as people think that this area has been picked over, we've only just gotten started.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to finish up with a question to each of you on, this is your moment now to pitch or at least share with us one or two really exciting companies that are in your portfolios, I guess in Carmichael and Jonathan's case, or other companies you've come across, Jigger, in all of your work with the LPO that you're really excited about and you want to just share briefly. Jonathan, do you want to go first? Sorry, I didn't prep you for this, so you may have nothing to say, but if you have something on top of your head.
We better be able to answer this. I would say, most interestingly, we just announced a little over 2 weeks ago now, along with our friends at ADQ, $1 billion investment into Tata Motors in India, spinning out effectively their EV business. And we're excited about this for many, many reasons, the underpenetration of EVs in India and the opportunity broadly. But what we think is really interesting about this is you have an existing traditional ICE car business where they're saying, we want to deliberately separate out the EV business, which is a unique thing because today, obviously, you have the opportunity to invest in companies like Tesla that are doing EVs in and of themselves, and you have the General Motors and Fords that are pursuing both strategies. This is an opportunity to really partner with an incumbent to develop their EV business. And we're very excited about where that can take us and the fact that we're able to spotlight what they're doing, a lot of really great things on the EV side.
Great, thank you. Carmichael, what about yourself?
This is one we can get ourselves in a lot of trouble, right, guys? I mean, yeah.
Which one of your children do you love the most?
No, but I'm going to answer. I'm going to caveat it. I'm going to answer it by prioritizing two companies that I think you'll see some really interesting news in the next 30 days. All right, 30 to 40 days. So one I mentioned nuclear. So I would look at Commonwealth Fusion Systems, CFS. It's really just a spectacular fusion company, out of MIT. They had a great result this summer that they actually publicized in real time, and I think you're going to hear some really interesting, exciting news about them, and so call it the next 60 days. And the other one that I'd pick is Source. So this is sort of a combination. This is capturing water ambiently from using something called a hydro panel, sunlight and air. And that company is a really interesting one because it both has a strong climate story in terms of what it does to eliminate things in manufacturing, but I think it just has a very good, overall do good for the world story, where providing clean drinking water to the masses, democratizing it.
Great, thank you. And Jigar, briefly, so which of your children do you love the most then?
I don't think I'm allowed to mention any children, but what I would say is that I think that there is a lot more specificity behind the Secretary of Energy's Earthshot initiatives. So we have a very clear pathway to reaching $1 a kilogram in hydrogen. We have a very clear pathway of reaching $100 a ton in CO2 capture, as well as with long duration energy storage. And so the one thing I would alert investors to is that DOE is not making this up. We have a very clear understanding of how these cost reductions are going to occur. And I think we all agree that if those cost reductions do occur by 2030, then all of these technologies become fully mainstream.
Great, that's a great forward-looking point to end on. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. I'm sure everyone will join me in giving them a warm round of applause for their time.
Please welcome to the stage Juvencio Maistu, Deputy CEO, Managing Board Member, and CFO of Inca Group, in conversation with Bloomberg Green reporter Jess Schenkelman.
Going to correct our voice of God because I've been practicing this backstage. Welcome, Juvencio Maistu.
Yeah, that's correct.
And you're the CFO of Inca Group, which to most people is IKEA. And you've said some very ambitious climate goals. We're going to talk about those today. First of all, you've been in Glasgow since Sunday. What's your impression of how the talks are going over at the SEC?
When I came here, I was expecting that the second week was more quiet after the first week, but I was impressed actually with the amount of people walking around the venue. So I felt a bit more, that it was more inclusive in the amount of people here. And then, of course, now what it has to come is actions out of these meetings.
Yeah. And one of the things that they're debating is about the role of offsetting. It's been a thorny issue for the last 3 years. Countries haven't been able to agree. How do you set up a global carbon market? What's your take on how is Inca Group and IKEA trying to use trading or offsets to reach its goals?
Okay. No, I think it's the good things and what is needed to complete that. I think the good thing is that we need a standard global carbon pricing, and it has to be standard and global. Otherwise, you create an unlevel playing field. Then this is good, but it's not enough, because I think it's important that there is transparency in the way that the revenues are from the tax is spent in the transition, in a just transition, and I think it's important. And it's important also that sometimes the elasticity of the prices doesn't follow 100%. So it's because then you can still have activities that are not good for the planet despite of higher prices. So that's what is important, action and the resources in the actual transition. And this is what we do in Inca Group. We are heavily investing in renewable energy. Today, we produce more renewable energy than the energy we consume. We are at more than 130% today. We have invested so far 2.5 billion, mainly in solar and wind, and we have committed additional 4 billion euros more. So it's not only about decarbonization, our footprint, which is of course important, is to go beyond and to do more. That's why we are working in these two areas at the same time, to really reduce the climate footprint into an approach, scope 1, 2, and 3, and the 3 is important, and at the same time to go beyond and to keep investing to create a positive. So my takeaway here is carbon pricing, global standard level, it's important and it's needed, but then we need to drive actual investments for the climate transition.
So how does a high carbon price affect your investments in the wind turbines or forestry projects?
No, what we do is to really use that resource that we do to do the actual investment. And then we don't maximize the financial revenues. We try to optimize what is financial return, but also what is the CO2 reduction. Because at the end of the day, it's about having a reasonable return on both, but also to drive a reduction of the climate footprint. Our leaders, for example, our country CEOs now, they have today financial goals, but they also have climate goals, carbon footprint goals as well. So it's pretty much anchored in the way we do performance to reduce the actual climate impact.
And so you're the CFO. We often have people in companies who are in charge of reducing emissions in the CSR department. How does it work at Inca Group? How do you interact with the environmental gurus? Do they come? Are you in all the meetings? Are you taking carbon emissions into every single financial decision that you make?
Yeah. First, I think it's important that in this transition first is to have a clear vision. In our case, it's easy because it's to create a better life for the many people, and it's pretty much in the DNA of who we are. But then it's about integrating in the decision making. And this is important. When we have defined standards, for example, when we are building IKEA store, or we are taking decision in fulfillment on last mile delivery, we are really defined what standards that we need to apply. So when the decisions are taken, it comes with this standard. So it is not either I save the wallet or I save the planet. They come really integrated. And it has been a process. And I feel really proud of that. The important thing is that you really need to invest time and effort in measurement. And you need to measure scope 1, 2, 3. You need to follow up. You need to be proud of the half-full glass, but then you need to be transparent in the half-empty glass, and then to show progress and to keep reducing that. That's why we have a clear view what is the total footprint from the raw materials to the end of life. And then we know and we are tracking everything. So it's really this half-empty glass where we need to show the progress.
And I want to ask you about Scope 3. First, I want to know, I know some companies set their own internal carbon price when they're making investments. Is that something that you do or you're considering doing?
No, what we do is to do the actual investment.
Yeah.
So because this is what I meant before. Because then you can put the price, but still, okay, but you keep going with the investment, because maybe you don't get 10%, you get 8%, but you keep going. And this is my point. This is wrong. You know what I mean? It's better than nothing. But then that's what I say. What are the standards we know? So, for example, in order to achieve outstanding in the BREEAM when you are setting up new buildings. So, for example, we have decided that by 2025, all the IKEA last mile deliveries, it will be EV or zero emission. But then we have said this is not enough. We have to say how much we do in 2020, in 21, in 22, and we are already 100% EV in Shanghai, in Amsterdam, 22 countries already implementing, and this is exactly what we do. And then it comes with a return, and then sometimes it's a higher or lower return. But I don't want to work in the other way, because you can keep going with the smaller profitability, and this is not what we are here for. We are really want to drive transition.
So we're going to talk about Scope 3 in all sorts of different ways. Last week at the talks, there was this big announcement from 100 different governments or subnational governments on ending deforestation by 2030. Were you encouraged by that? Do you see that filtering down and affecting the way that you are able to buy products and ensure that you are also building furniture that is not deforesting?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that IKEA does not contribute to deforestation. When it comes to forestry, and what is really important for the climate is A, to stop deforestation, B, is to reforest, and 3 is to responsibly manage the existing forests. And it is the responsible management of the existing forest that has to be a norm. And this is why FSC is the best standard we have today, because it's internationally recognized, and then we need to keep improving. Everything has to be improved. And then we can say that more than 90% of the wood that they use in IKEA products are either FSC or recycled. And then by doing that, you really contribute to better forest practices and really to a better climate. Then, on top of that, it was based on this is a beautiful thing, how low cost and sustainability comes together. Because then we work really hard to reduce with innovation, to reduce the wood that is used in the IKEA product with particle board, honeycomb, and board on frame technique. Then it's about giving a second life to the product. That's why we are really working hard with the reselling pre-love IKEA furniture. Last year, we resold more than 31 million of that. And then on top of that, the wood, these chairs, this is carbon storage forever. So this chair will keep carbon storage as long as it is not burned. So when you work in an end-to-end approach and really, really securing responsible management of the forest, this is good for nature and good for the people working on that.
So you mentioned FSC, which is the Forestry Steward Commission.
Yes.
And earlier this year, there was some investigation which found that some of the timber you were buying actually was coming from illegal deforestation. And IKEA Inca Group dropped those suppliers, and I think actually went further and dropped all suppliers from Russia that were, they were saying they were doing something called sanitary felling, which I don't fully understand, but they weren't doing that, they were illegally deforesting. So talk us through that process. When you have a commitment to not illegally deforest, is it immediately, you hear about this investigation and you just drop the suppliers, or is there more of a longer process?
So the important thing is that you need to have a system that you can trust. That's what we say. In our case, we can confirm that more than 98% is FSC certified or it is recycled. So there's no illegal cutting into the IKEA supply chain. So that's why we say, then the system is what is really important to follow and to monitor. And then when things are found and when deviation happen or when wrong thing happen, this is where you have to feel confident that the system is detecting enough. And then we are always super good in collaborating with any kind of NGO, any kind of so we need all of us, we need all of us to say this is right, but this is wrong. And then the system has to support and to eliminate that. Then there is external, according with FSC, auditors verifying that. But we are in IKEA, it was more than 450 internal auditors as well, in order to put more pressure that there is a lot of control. And then when things are happening, depending on the case, either you start to have very clear in a correction time, in a time frame, and then you follow up. And then, of course, if things don't improve, then it's game over. But this is important that once you identify, actions are taken.
And do you think that the FSC system is up to standard, is up to scratch, if it's allowing some of these illegal deforestation projects to get through the system, or do you think it's working and that's why you were able to identify?
I think the FSC is the best system we know so far, and it's the best thing that is used because it provides an international standard. We cannot rely country by country with different standards, because then you are lost what is good or what is bad, or you are accepting different levels. And this is the good platform of FSC. It's the best it has, and then it has to keep improving on a permanent basis. And this is why it's so important that people come together and then help FSC to develop, and because this is in the interest of everyone.
And then the other element of Scope 3 is how do your customers dispose of their furniture? And I'm sure I've definitely been guilty of having something from IKEA for a couple of years and then getting rid of it to get something else. So you talk about giving furniture a second life. What's the process? Have you got, I know, for example, Patagonia uses eBay to resell some of its clothes. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, we, as I said before, we are tracking the whole footprint. And then we know how much is coming from the material, how much from the production, how much from the transport, how much from the operations, how much in the customer travels, but also how much in the consumer usage, which is 22%. So it's significant, the concept. That's why we, for example, were super determined to move into only LED range. And then at that time, I remember it was 2016, that the LED bulbs were around 9.9 euros on average, depending. And then it was more expensive than the traditional bulb. I said, no, we have to go full in. And then, yeah, but what about the pricing? And then we are low price for the customer. That's why we said, either we go full in or we will never go over. And that's when we reduced to €1. And today we only sell LED, and we keep innovating to keep reducing the consumption. And then what we are doing now, we are doing a lot of initiatives in many countries. We have, we call Green Friday, Black Friday, where customers can return a pre-loved furniture, and then we give a second chance. We sold, as I said before, more than 31 million of this pre-loved furniture. Spare part, we are providing for free more than 14 million spare part to secure that things are not. And then IKEA has assessed all the products when it comes to circularity, according to all the parameters, and there is a big agenda now to really accelerate the transition. And then in Inca Investment, for example, we are investing in circular businesses. We recently invested in a company called Retour Mattress in the Netherlands. They are recycling mattress. Mattress is very difficult to recycle because you have foam, you have metal, you have textile, you have a lot of components. Only these companies recycling now 1.5 million mattresses, which is all the mattresses in Netherlands. So you can imagine how big it is. And it comes with a good EBITDA. So it's a good business to be good business. So that's what is important in the circularity, is that all the products are designed for circularity, because then at the end, upstream, because then at the end it's easier to do that, but also that you give a second life to the product, but also all the activities we can do to really accelerate circularity in society. And here is when I'm also asking for partnership with many more companies, so we are really happy to collaborate, and we are keen to get in contact with many companies, circularity. And it's my ask to the governments that they can also accelerate the infrastructure in the cities for consumers. It has to be easy for you.
And how do you square the idea of, wanting people to buy more of your products, but also knowing that the more products they buy, the more resource pressure that's put on the planet? Because I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been to IKEA to go and buy one thing and left with about 500 things, because I have to, and you make us walk all the way around every single different item. Can't you just put up a sign saying, do you really need this? Is this what you came in for?
It's about making a better life at home. Why? What is the whole thinking? The first thing, you have to do your homework as a company. The first thing is that IKEA has to be climate positive. And we have decided, and we will deliver, that by 2030, IKEA will reduce more greenhouse gas emissions that the IKEA value chain emit while growing the IKEA business. So if at the end of the day, you can prove that your business is no harmful, is not creating any problem for the planet because it's fully circular, and if this is like that, as we are now doing, and we are in the journey to close the gap that we need still to close, then if we add that, then you are creating tax, you are creating employment, but also, what is very important, that the product that we can offer to you, it's also helping you to have a better life at home. For example, food storage. We need to help customers to reduce food waste. For example, electricity. We need to help customers to be renewable. That's how we are now selling a lot of home solar solutions to customers. Or for example, water reduction. All the IKEA taps now reduce water. Or the plant bowl. We are famous for the meatball. Now we have decided that more than 50% of the IKEA food has to be plant-based food. And IKEA, have you tried the plant bowl? It's fantastic.
Not yet, but I will.
It tastes fantastic and it's super good price. This is for me the second part. So you have to become fully positive. You have to promote the second life. And on top of that, IKEA product has to provide you a better, a more sustainable life at home at affordable prices. And this is super important. Sustainability cannot be a luxury for the few. It has to be affordable for the many. If not, it will not take off. We run with Global Scan a big survey in 30 countries talking directly with consumers. 7 out of 10 were really worried about climate, but only 4 out of 10 said we are taking actions. So there was a gap in between the one that was worried and those not taking action. And you know what they said about the barrier? It's too expensive or I don't know. That's why IKEA plays a big role, because we can make sustainable solutions at affordable prices, and we need to help not only a better life at home, but also better living at home.
You think IKEA might start selling electric cars then?
Nothing is impossible, but what I can promise is by 2025, all the deliveries last mile will be in EV vehicles.
Okay, well you heard it here first. And you got your plug for plant-based Swedish meatballs as well.
It's fantastic, you have to try.
Okay, thank you very much, Juvencio.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage PSEG CEO Ralph Izzo and Google's Amanda Peterson Corio with Bloomberg NEF's Albert Chung.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel. I think it's the last panel of the day on accelerating adoption of renewable energy. So at BNEF, we've been tracking renewables for somewhere around 15 years. We've seen enormous growth just from megawatt scale up to more than 200 gigawatts of renewables being installed every year at the moment. And we've seen the economics transform so that renewables are now the cheapest source of electricity in many parts of the world, and policymakers beginning to really understand that and put in place mechanisms to drive adoption. But at the same time, we need much more. According to our New Energy Outlook, we need to quintuple wind deployments and triple solar deployments and maintain that level for the rest of this decade to get on track for Paris and net zero by 2050. So there's a lot of work to do. And I'm delighted to be talking to Ralph and Amanda, who you can share, I think, some really deep experiences and perspectives on how we're going to rise to that challenge. So welcome to the Bloomberg Green Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd first like to ask you both, is renewable energy boring now? I mean, so we've had this amazing 2-day summit. We've talked about carbon offsets, about innovation and technology in cities and everything. And here we are at the end of day 2 talking about renewables. Are we taking renewables for granted? Has it become boring?
Yes, well, I'll go ahead and give my perspective. I mean, the fact that you're even asking that question is emblematic of just how far we've come over the last decade, right? When I think about 2009 in California, right, solar was just starting to become commercialized, and look at where we are today. But as you pointed out and what you just said, we're still going to need large volumes, right? To get to net zero by 2050, IEA is saying we need 3 to 4 times. So while it may be boring, and that's a good thing, right, we're still going to need to scale, and we're going to need a lot more of it. But yes, I think as I think about my own personal conversations that I've had both here and over the past year, the conversations are really turning to next generation technologies and new technologies, right? We're going to continue to deploy more wind and solar, but the conversations are really changing in the industry.
Ralph? I don't think it's a sign of anything other than a maturation of the whole dialogue. There was some great news coming out of Saudi Arabia about 1.04 cents per kWh for solar farms. But we're beginning to realize that, wow, we need to focus our attention on the problem. The problem is greenhouse gases, and let's not jump to the one, albeit very important solution, i.e. renewables. Let's talk about offsets. Let's talk about nuclear. Let's talk about energy efficiency. So I don't think renewables have gotten boring. They're on a trajectory. People are comfortable with that trajectory, and they realize that the magnitude of the issue demands attention to some other tools that might be in the toolkit.
So both of you are US-based. I do want to spend a bit of time on the US policy landscape because there's a huge amount of focus right now, a lot of attention on Washington. Now the US, I think for those of you who don't know, has had a lot of success deploying renewables through systems of tax credits and renewable portfolio standards. We now have an infrastructure bill that's going to promote grid investment and storage. We don't yet have an economic stimulus bill that contains more tax credits. I'm just keen to hear your reflections on, are these packages the right packages that the US needs? Are the right things in there? Are there things missing that we wish we could have in these big legislative packages?
Go ahead. Okay, man. I learned a long time ago, Albert, to not let perfection become the enemy of the good. So what I'd say is that what's in the Build Back Better plan, the one that you referred to, is phenomenally important. Production tax credits for renewables, continuing those. There's also a little known provision in there that is essential for preservation of 50% of the nation's carbon-free electricity today, which is a production tax credit for existing nuclear plants. Again, if we want to get stronger, if we want to have further reductions, we shouldn't give up the progress that we've made. So I think that there's much to speak well of in the current Build Back Better. My one preference, if somebody would allow me an opportunity to seek perfection as opposed to just what's good enough, it would be an economy-wide price on carbon. Because the focus on electricity, while merited, it has now led to electricity being the number 2 source of carbon emissions in America, with transportation number 1. But both of those basically amounting to a little over 2/3 of the emissions. So you've got a whole third of other opportunities to look at. So I think tax credits with the economy-wide price on carbon would really catapult us forward in terms of our development of technologies and carbon reductions.
Amanda?
Yeah, I would say we're absolutely happy to see the bipartisan passage of the infrastructure bill, and there's a lot in there, and it's a lot needed in the U.S. in particular. One thing we were happy to see is there's $30 billion for demonstration projects. So as I mentioned, it's going to take more than wind and solar, and so looking at how we develop these new technologies. We're also supportive of the Buy Back Better Act, and as Ralph mentioned, we created a marketplace that's operating really well with the ITC and the PTC extension for wind and solar. It's developed, it's established, let's keep it going. And I think what that bill really got right was including, as you mentioned, other technologies, right, to expand it beyond, to keep nuclear that isn't at the end of its life online, and to think about other things, carbon capture, et cetera, et cetera. So. And then one little known thing in the bill that we're excited about as well is thinking about market reform and regional grids in parts of the country, that we could see better interconnection within our system, and how those market works for end users like us. We heard John Kerry talk about that this morning, right? We can't get an electron from California to New York. And so that's part of the bill act as well that we're happy to see.
Yeah, and looking slightly longer term, there's an ambition to get to 80% clean power in the US by 2030, so that's 9 years from now. What is it now? It's probably about 40% carbon-free power in the US?
That's if you include nuclear and hydro, yes.
Yeah, about 40%. So we need to roughly double that. What's that going to take? I mean, what else do we need to be thinking about to get to that sort of penetration so quickly?
Well, please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think you really need an economy-wide price signal, because it may make more sense for some agricultural practice modification, some industrial process modification, some building efficiency, to be the wiser thing to do than blank, whether that blank is a rooftop solar system or an offshore wind system. The issue has been the waxing and waning of policy direction in the United States. What's been so phenomenally important about COP has been, I am now 100% convinced that the policy arrow globally is in one direction. We may quarrel over the pace at which we will take that direction upon ourselves, but businesses aren't waiting for government anymore. I mean, Alphabet has done a phenomenal job of making pledges about when they're going to get to net zero. We've done the same thing. But the confusion that gets created by this hodgepodge of solutions really stifles investment and innovation. I ask people this absurd little pop quiz, and I make fun of my own home state of New Jersey, although I admonish people that I'm sure that if I knew something about your geography, I could do the same. And I ask people, how much is it worth the New Jersey economy to avoid the emissions of 1 ton of carbon? Is it worth $400? Is it worth $100? Is it worth $17? Or is it worth negative $125? And the snarkiness results from the fact that I don't give you the right answer. The right answer is all the above. Well, how can it be worth $400 per ton at the same time it's worth negative $125 per ton? And that's because we don't have a visible price. Instead, we pick and choose technologies that we think will work. And the negative 125, for the folks who are interested, is the one that gets the least attention, and that's energy efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, as we already talked about, we need to scale and we need to do it faster, right? Yeah. From a private sector point of view, right, it's, and Ralph touched on it, it's clarity in policy, clarity in law, clarity in regulation, so that, again, we're talking about long-lived assets here. So I need to know today if I make an investment or I buy an offtake that the rules aren't going to change next year. And we're seeing that in different parts of the world actively, and it makes dollars on the sidelines skittish to get involved or to buy offtake because they need to understand the risk. But I think also, and prior to Google, I was a developer, I was an investor, so I've played in all parts of the value chain, and what the problems remain the same, at least in the US, right, of the interconnection queue and having real projects and the timing and the cost and how cost is allocated. A clarity in permitting and how these projects can get done, land cost, supply chain issues. Anything that adds ambiguity into the process slows down scale and commercial adoption at scale. And so those are the things that we think about in working with our partners to develop the infrastructure we need, right?
Yeah, for sure. Grid development and supply chains, as you say, completely critical. Ralph, can we talk a little bit about New Jersey in particular? I mean, I think energy transition is global, but it's also always very local. So maybe if you could share just a bit of the particular opportunities and challenges that you faced or that you are facing in the transition in New Jersey.
Yeah, we're trying to take a three-phased approach to the issue. Phase number one is to make sure that we're using as little energy as we need to meet the needs of the economy and lifestyle. The other quiz I ask people is, and I can't see perfectly well with these lights on, but how many folks woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour? Right, that's the honest reaction that I always get. So we begin with energy efficiency. We say, let's make sure that our energy consumption per dollar of GDP and our dollars of GDP per capita are optimized. Then we say, okay, now that we've done that, let's see if we can maximize the amount of minimize the amount of carbon that we're emitting, and that means lose no ground. So in New Jersey, 90% of our carbon-free energy is nuclear, 40% of our energy is nuclear, so we want to keep those plants alive. And there are imperfections in the competitive market in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast United States that puts those plants at risk. After that, we say let's increase the supply of carbon-free energy. For New Jersey, that means offshore wind. We've spent a lot of time and money on rooftop solar. It is extremely expensive. It's what costs $400 per ton of carbon avoided. But we're seeing the supply chain develop for offshore wind and the price for offshore wind come down rather precipitously. The state has an ambition to develop 7.5 gigawatts, which will produce about 30 terawatt hours of electricity, which is about 40% of New Jersey's electricity demand, albeit not dispatchable. And then we have to turn our attention to the number one source of carbon emissions in this state, and that's transportation. So we're number 6 in the nation in electric vehicle penetration. We have a $200 million infrastructure build-out program to get over range phobia. But there's this chicken and egg issue about, well, if you don't buy the cars, we're not going to build the infrastructure. If you don't build the infrastructure, we're not going to buy the cars, but hopefully we'll make progress. So it's use less, use cleaner, and then sadly, because we've been slow to act, a critical part is adaptation. And we've invested billions of dollars in strengthening the grid. And our 2 endpoints that we can point to in terms of success is that back in 2012, we had a major event called Superstorm Sandy, where 1.8 million out of our 2 million customers lost power. We've spent the ensuing decade hardening the grid, and we recently had something called Tropical Storm Ida, which had a very similar flooding footprint, and we only lost 5% of our customers. So it really is use less, use cleaner, and make the grid more resilient, because in the future, we'll be charging our vehicles, charging our phones, charging our computers, and doing a whole bunch of different things.
Can I follow up on the point about offshore wind in particular? Sure. I mean, we're very excited about the opportunities for offshore wind globally and in the US. We see huge growth potential. I know PSEG has made one major investment this year. Do you see the company playing a bigger role in that beyond New Jersey, or how, where do you see the future role for PSEG?
So a qualified yes, certainly beyond New Jersey, but not as big a role as I wish we would have played. And it's an important issue as it relates to COP. One of the common arguments you hear in policy circles in Washington against being too aggressive is that, well, what good does it do if nation A, B, and C don't do the same? And you know who A and B are, certainly, if not C. And my argument against that is, we decided about 10 years ago in New Jersey to invest in offshore wind, and then we stopped. And there was a change in administration, and now we have an administration that's eager to invest in offshore wind, and we're not alone. Multiple states are investing in offshore wind to the tune of 30 gigawatts. But look at who the dominant players are. Yes, we're making a major investment. We own 25% of a project that Ørsted is developing because they're the world leader. A competitor of ours, First Energy, is making a major investment with Royal Dutch Shell. Iberdrola is there with Avangrid. So the leading offshore wind companies are European companies. Why? Do they have better engineers than us? With all due respect, no. But they've been at it for 10 years. So they know how to do it. So this notion that we should wait for others to lead, I think, is a massive mistake. We ought to be the ones developing advanced batteries, advanced nuclear fuel cycles, small modular reactors, higher efficiency solar, better materials for larger wind turbines, so that we can become the major exporter, if you believe, as I do, that the arrow is pointing in one direction. I believe that by the end of the Governor Murphy's second administration, we will have commitments to build 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. Whether or not one US company is the primary developer, I am doubtful of.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting, and we look forward to seeing how that plays out. Amanda, a big part of your role is actually buying renewables, and in the US, that's actually quite a mature activity that you can do through systems of PPAs and things like that, and Google has been a major leader in that. Outside of the US, it's a bit more complicated. It may not be that straightforward to go to the market. So how are you operating in other markets? How are you squaring that circle?
Yep. No, so we are a global company and we have a global footprint, and our 24/7 carbon-free initiative, which we may talk about, is really starting to look at going beyond 100% renewable, which is matching on an annual basis anywhere in the world, to focusing regionally and hourly to always procure carbon-free energy. And so that requires us to think about the harder grids and think about our grids globally. And I think this is really where policy and thinking about market reform is extremely important, right? And our hardest markets are generally in Asia, which is many island nations with a lot of LNG import economies, right? Without a lot of naturally occurring wind and solar, or the land to support it, so these are ones that are going to require different technologies and different solutions to solve the problem. But really important, sorry, I jumped around, but to talk back about market reform, in Taiwan, for example, where we have a location that a lot of suppliers and technology suppliers are based, until recently, as an end user buyer, you couldn't go to the utility and get any form of renewable or carbon-free energy. You couldn't request it. But we worked with the government there over a number of years, and in 2017, they amended their Electricity Act to allow for direct wheeling of renewables to end users and to work within the system to do that. And that was a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, but shortly thereafter that, we immediately signed our first corporate power purchase agreement, the first one in Taiwan. But more importantly, and I was having a conversation at the lunch table today about this, it's not just about us, right? Because Google alone can't solve this, right? It changed the Electricity Act so others could do it too. And very shortly thereafter, TSMC signed the largest corporate power purchase agreement of 920 megawatts of offshore wind. So it opened up the market for end users to really transact in that market. And so when we look at other places in the world, each one has its own regulatory system and own market structure, and we have to figure out, is there an opportunity, and what's the best way for us as end users to work within that and change that if we need to.
And that's great, and I think that's a good example of how supply chains that are trying to green themselves can actually promote forward progress on market design, on policy in different markets. Let's go back to 24/7 clean energy, and you mentioned a bit about kind of some new technologies. What technologies are you excited about, or what are you looking at there?
Yeah, and so, and even tying that back to the question you asked before, the technologies, like we already talked about, we're going to need a lot more wind and solar. That's a given. We're going to keep doing that, and we're going to do it where it makes sense and it's economically viable. But depending on where you are in the world, you're going to need a different technology to solve the problem, right? It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, right? So we're looking at a whole bunch of technologies. Many of them we've heard discussed here and at COP in general, whether that's short duration, long duration storage, carbon sequestration, capture and sequestration, green hydrogen, and then even this year we did the first corporate offtake with an advanced geothermal extraction company looking at new methods, and this is in the US and Nevada, and this is really interesting because the same technology that was developed in the shale gas era, right, is now being used to access pockets of geothermal technology that you couldn't get to before. So it's really repurposing that in a way that we can get carbon-free generation, right, and really promoting that. But again, the solution for one specific technology in one part of the world may not make sense in another, so we are looking at all of it, right, and being very technology inclusive in how we think about that.
Great. Coming back to you, Ralph, your company has set a 2030 net zero target. I think it was pulled forward, right? It was
2046, and we pulled it forward.
And pulled it forward. Now, I think the skeptics will say, and I'm an analyst, so I have to be skeptical.
Yeah, that's fine.
That you're doing that by selling your fossil portfolio and hanging on to your nuclear, and that won't actually solve the net zero challenge for the power system in New Jersey. So, what's your thought? What's your thinking on
that? No, there's a large element of truth to that, and we're not shy about admitting to it. So, right now, our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, 1 and 2 are about 50% of our emissions. Scope 3 is about 50% of our emissions. We've done a lot of things that do help the planet with respect to the dominant part of Scope 1 and Scope 2, which are our power plant emissions. We shut our 2 coal plants in New Jersey. We shut our coal plant in Connecticut. We shut 2,500 megawatts of what are called high energy delivery day peaking units, which were a combination of oil and natural gas. So all of that stuff helped the planet. But to your point, we have probably the most efficient natural gas fleet in the nation at an average heat rate of 7,200 BTUs per kWh. And while we wanted to get out of that business, it would have been a shareholder travesty if we'd simply shut them down. So we sold that. So that won't help the planet, but it does help our signature. Once that transaction closes, which will be sometime early in Q1 next year, we'll be about 80% Scope 3 and only 20% Scope 1 and Scope 2. The dominant remaining issue in Scopes 1 and 2 is something that we can't solve because it would violate the laws of physics. It's ohmic dissipation in our power lines. It's I squared R loss. So to the extent that we're carrying anything that originates from a fossil fuel, we're still stuck with that. So we'll need offsets to handle that. There's a couple other things that we'll have to work on in terms of our own vehicle fleet and electrifying that. But by and large, the other dominant thing will be leaks from our gas distribution system, which we are spending $400 million a year correcting right now. So our big challenge in the future from the point of view of helping the planet will be Scope 3. And that's why you will be bored to tears at how many times I will mention energy efficiency if anybody stands still for longer than 5 minutes as an important consideration for us to apply. But no, you're spot on, Albert. You know, we've done some things that genuinely help the planet and the company, and we've done other things that are neutral to the planet but help the company. And selling an efficient gas fleet isn't going to change the fact that they will continue to operate. But you know, I'm so pleased to hear Amanda say what she did about embracing all the tools in the toolkit. And I do think carbon capture, sequestration, storage is an important consideration, especially for the US. The consumer dividend associated with natural gas cannot be ignored. And it is a relatively clean fuel. There's no SO2, there's no mercury, there's no fine particulate matter, but it is a carbon problem. So one should not give up on that possibility, even though we're no longer operating those plants and have no economic interest in it.
And just quickly on distributed energy, maybe Amanda, how much of this could be hosted on site, whether it's sort of on-site batteries, on-site solar, or even fuel cells and things like that? Is that a big part of your thinking? Or,
yeah,
or not?
we get this question a lot, like, oh great, can you build solar and wind at your data centers? And we do, but it's yes and, right? So for example, we have a 5 megawatt system, solar system in our Belgian data center. Our annual energy consumption in 2020 was over 15 terawatt hours, right? So we have, with limited resources, it's where you're gonna have the biggest impact and we're utility scale. Right, so we can do that, but really we still need to play within the markets and think on a utility scale level and everywhere that we operate. But what we can do and are doing, I think, is really, data centers in particular have been thought of as we run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You want to access your cat video on YouTube morning, noon, and night, right? So our data centers are running, and we are typically, we're not very flexible in that, right? We don't have a lot of demand response capabilities, but what we're trying to do is work on that, and we're doing that in a few ways. One, we are actually in Belgium, we're piloting replacing our backup diesel generators. That's necessary in this changing climate, that we have some kind of backup with batteries, and not just having them sit there as backup, but actually participate within the grid to provide grid services at the same time. Another thing that we are doing and looking at is what we call carbon-aware computing. So that means that there are certain tasks that always have to be on, and they're sensitive to time. But there are other tasks that can be run at different times of the day. And how can we shift to run those tasks at our data center when the grid is the greenest, right? When the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and not running them at times of day that aren't good for the grid, and we're having to rely on gas or some kind of thermal generator. So those are, I think, yes, we can do that, but really when we think about how can we have larger scale impact, these are the types of things that we're doing to create a healthy balance with the grid.
Wonderful. Well, I can see on the clock that we are out of time now, and I've actually leave this panel feeling quite the opposite of boring. Actually, I think there's so much work ahead of us to do, and I'm really glad that we have folks like you working on these really difficult problems. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of the Bloomberg Green Summit here at COP. We hope you've enjoyed the conversations and the discussions, and we hope you leave armed with at least 1 or 2 new ideas about how you can accelerate climate change, because as we've heard repeatedly yesterday and today, is, we really don't have the luxury of time.
That's right. Right here in this room, we heard from John Kerry. What he took away from these past 2 weeks is there is a greater sense of urgency, but there's also a greater sense of possibility. And with that, I'd like to thank our speakers and moderators for the absolutely wonderful conversations that we've been able to enjoy across this day. We also want to thank our founding partner, JLL, and our presenting sponsors, Dassault Systems and MSCI, for their support of today's event.
And of course, we want to thank you for being an incredible audience, but we're not done with you yet. We want to stay engaged. We want you to continue the conversation. So do reach out to us on social media. We are active there. It's #BloombergGreen. And you can check out our website, bloomberggreen.com. You can sign up to a daily newsletter from our fantastic green editorial team. I'm Malika Kapoor, Deputy Editor of Bloomberg Live.
And I'm Patrick Garrigan, Global Head of Bloomberg Live. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
I got this feeling inside my bones. It goes electric wavy when I turn it on. Off from my city, off from my home. We're flying up no ceiling when we in our zone. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got